work with us. Yeah, go ahead, Krishna. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'll go for it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There it is. So I'm speaking to you now from Vancouver on the traditional and unceded land of the Squamish Tsleil-Waututh people. And I want to talk to you today about the Canada Child Benefit and how it affected household spending. This is joint work with an undergraduate student at SFU, Paniz, Najjarrezaparast, and the context is that in July 2016, the Canada Child Benefit replaced a kind of a hodgepodge of other programs that wrote checks to families with children. At the time, we had a Canada Child Tax Benefit, a supplemental child benefit. That thing varied across provinces because some provinces stole it and some provinces didn't. And we also had that Tory Universal Child Benefit. And so all of these were like swept away and replaced with a new thing called the Canada Child Benefit. And the two key features of that change were it was much bigger than all those other programs, and it increased the benefit rate by about $2,300 per child per year. And it reduced the implicit tax on these benefits to about 7%, meaning that you're already facing a tax system, and if you get the child benefit, you face a 7% clawback rate on that child benefit. And previously, the clawback rate was much higher for most of those benefits. So this was the biggest change in redistribution policy in Canada in 4 decades, really. This was a massive thing. It cost $25 billion a year in extra spending. It was aimed at children, whereas the previous big thing we did was the phase-in of Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security in the mid-1970s. And so in this paper, which is published in Canadian Public Policy, like sometime in 2021, in this paper, we ask, what were the consequences? So one consequence that is pretty easy to see is a consequence on poverty rates. Basically, you write a lot of checks to households with children that are mostly, in the bottom half of the distribution, and they're going to have more money, and they're going to not be in poverty as much. And so this graph goes from 2006 to 2019 and shows poverty rates via the low income measure. The thick line is the poverty rate for children, which was kind of like, 15, 18% for the decade preceding 2016. And then it dropped like a lot. It dropped from about 13% to about 7% over the next 5 years. So this policy change had a massive effect on poverty. So in this paper, we kind of look at the next, well, they got the money and were less in poverty. And so the question is, what do they do with that money? There is a little bit of research on this. We knew a bit. We knew that from old research that food spending might increase when you increase child benefits and reduce poverty. You can improve a variety of health and educational outcomes for children. And one of the mechanisms is by spending on direct education inputs and on indirect education inputs, of which food is one. All of these papers use a survey run by Statistics Canada called the Surveys of Household Spending, which is an annual cross-sectional survey that StatsCan has been conducting in a kind of a similar way since 1996. And all of those papers compare calendar year variation, like year after a policy change, to figure out what happened to spending. So the RDCs are amazing. The RDCs, research data centers, are are secure locations, mostly in universities, where researchers can access confidential Statistics Canada data in a secure and confidential setting. The security happens because these are in like little rooms that are not connected to the outside world. And so you can be confident that your confidential data is safe and will not leak. And following confidentiality protocols of the following type. If any number is to be removed from a research data center, it has to go through a Statistics Canada vetting procedure that ensures that nothing about any individual person will be released. And this kind of set of research data centers has allowed researchers to analyze data in their raw form, typically at a smaller level of granularity or spatial specificity or timing than we previously were able to do. So this really is a revolution in data access in Canada, and it's had a really big effect because researchers can use better data to analyze questions. So the confidential data of the surveys of household spending that are in the RDCs have two advantages over those used by the most recent work, which is Jones, Milligan, and Stabile, I really should learn how to pronounce his name. That guy. That is, in the confidential data, we can take advantage of the fact that these data are collected monthly. It's like you have data that look annual, but in fact, they're collected in 12 monthly waves. So I have monthly data about monthly cross-sections of data about consumers. And these months cover this very large increase in child benefits that occurred in July 2016. And with these monthly cross-sections, we can identify households that have children of the right age to collect the benefits, but where age is like really accurate. It's to the month. And so I can tell when your children age in and age out of program eligibility. And I can see before and after this mid-year policy change. So each year of the survey of household spending collects data on about 12,000 households, and it's like 1,000 a month. And so in the survey, respondents are asked to fill out questionnaires that detail their retrospective spending over the previous month for things that are kind of high frequency, like food, or 3 months for medium frequency stuff like clothing, and 12 months for like low frequency stuff like household furnishing. And all the data are at the annual level. So it's trying to construct annual expenditures for a person that was contacted, say, in March of 2016. And we're going to compare them to a person who was contacted in, say, November of 2016. So that's a before and an after the policy change person. And we're going to use repeated cross-sections of households at the calendar month level for 48 months from January 2014 to December 2017. The way we're going to try and identify what happened to household spending as in response to this policy is we're going to use what's called a difference in differences estimator. And the idea here is we're going to look at how households with children behaved before versus after the policy change. That is, before versus after they got $2,400 per year per child more money from government. And we're going to account for the possibility of like time trends that follow the policy change for some reason by netting out the time trend of a control group, which is people without children, because those people didn't get an increase in payments from government. So if you define a variable called policy date that's equal to 1 in months on or after August 2016, and policy target equal to 1 for households with children under 18, those are the guys who are eligible for the payment, and X as a vector of controls, a constant, dummies for calendar year, dummies for calendar month, province of residence, and city size, then we can think about how a set of response variables, which I'll call Y, respond to the change in child benefits, this massive increase in payments to households. And the outcome variables that I'm going to look at are total consumption and spending on 7 constituent categories of total consumption. And those categories are food, shelter, clothing, health, a weird thing called household operation, transportation, and recreation. And I'm going to focus within a couple of these categories to look at rent, because some people spend money on rent for their shelter and others on mortgages and other stuff. And for clothing, I'm going to look at adult and children clothing, since this is a child benefit. You get the novelty check, it says child benefit. In household operation, there's a subcategory called childcare, and I'm going to look at that. The regression methodology is very, very simple. It corresponds to this difference in difference idea. I'm going to regress one of these outcome variables, y, on those control variables x, the policy date, the policy target, and the interaction of the policy date and policy target. So X is going to pick up all the seasonality because stuff like clothing is kind of seasonal. You buy more in the winter. Policy date is going to pick up whether or not it's after the policy has taken effect. And policy target is, do you have children in your household? And the estimated coefficient on the interaction term is an estimate of the average effect on an outcome variable Y of the change in the policy. So from here on, I'm just going to show you estimates of that interaction term, and I'm going to interpret those as the effect of the policy change on people spending in all these different categories. So you might wonder whether I even have enough households with children and whether I have enough, particularly in the bottom half of the distribution. So these are just the counts, the number of observations that I have. On the left-hand side of this table, it says, well, I got 12,500 observations in total in my bottom half of the population with no elderly people. Got to get rid of the elderly because there were also changes to the way we financed old age security in this period. And then the little square table at the bottom of the left side says, well, how many are pre-August 2016? How many are post? And how many have children and how many don't have children? And the bottom line there is, I got some in each of these categories. And then on the right-hand side, I distinguish between renters and owners. And that is because when I get to the estimates, you're going to see immediately that I'm only going to want to talk about renters. And so for renters, I've only got about 6,000 observations. But even still, in each of these 4 bits of the box, I have some observations that I can use to identify these parameters. So here I have, I'm not going to talk about the, okay. So the bottom line with the descriptives is that let's just look down the column for renters in the middle. The total expenditure of these households, this is households in the bottom half of the distribution, is a little under $30,000. And so that's kind of what I want to compare to. And the big expenditure categories are, not surprisingly, shelter and food. Shelter is about $10,000 or $11,000, so it's a third, and food is about $5,000. It's a sixth of total spending. And these ones are big, so they draw the eye. These are the estimates for all of this. And if you look at the right-hand column for, so the little squares around stars are telling you estimates that are precisely estimated enough to know whether they're actually different from 0. And if you look in the right-hand column, you see that there are no little squares around stars for owners. And what that says is nothing is really drawing the eye when you look at owner occupancy households. Not much happened to any category of expenditure that we can be precise enough about to say much with confidence. In contrast, when you look at renters, you see lots of little squares. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that middle column out and look at it. So you see that the top row here shows the effect of the policy change on total expenditure, and it pushed total expenditures up by $3,000 for a household with children. So that's a pretty large policy effect. We had a policy that increased transfers by about $2,400 per child per year, and that increased expenditures on average for households with children by about $3,500. So it's a big deal, remembering that these households only had an average expenditure of $30,000. This is like a 11% increase. It's big. And the bigness of it is why poverty rates went down, right? It's a big deal. If you ask, well, what did they increase their spending on most? These rental tenure households had the largest effect on rent. So this is kind of surprising, because in some sense, rent should be the hardest to adjust thing, right? I mean, you gotta move or something like that to take advantage, to improve your lot by spending more money on rent. And so the largest effect is on rent, shelter. It's about a third of that overall increase, about $1,000 more on rent. The second largest is food, about $700 more on food. And so what this policy did is it put food on the table and roofs over the head of poor children. You might worry, I mean, I worried that when you increase the budgets of a whole bunch of poor families that are already living in rental accommodation, their wicked landlords would just raise their rents, so that this additional spending on rent would not actually lead to anything good. In the paper, we show that that is most likely not the case. We show mild evidence that these households use their increased rent expenditures to get housing that is in better condition and larger with more bedrooms. We also show mild evidence that they are moving, that there's moving that is induced by this change in policy. So this rent, the shelter expenditure, which you might worry is just stolen by evil landlords, we think probably not. The last thing I want to point your attention to is that clothing expenditures went up by about $300, but that's mostly driven by children's clothing expenditures. And this suggests that the naming of the program might be an important thing here. So the last, I said that was the last thing, but the really last thing I want to point to in this table is that if you look in household operations and then you look at childcare, you don't see a little box with some stars in it, which means that we can't really tell if childcare expenditures rose as a consequence of households having more money in their pockets due to the child benefit. So this is the bottom line. This very large increase in child benefits that occurred in July 2016 raised the expenditure of rental tenure households with children, mainly through increases in rental spending, food spending, and children's clothing spending. And it was, I would say, massively important. This is the most important thing we've done in 40 years. And we're still doing it. The Canada Child Benefit continues to expand. It was $6,400 a child in 2016. It's now $6,833 per child. In British Columbia, there's an additional benefit called the Child Opportunity Benefit, which is an additional $1,600 per child. And so now in British Columbia, you're talking about $8,500 per child per year in child benefits. And these benefits are refundable. If you don't pay any taxes, you're still getting this child benefit. So one way I like to think about what the Canada Child Benefit is that it is a basic income system for households with children. So we wonder, are basic income programs possible? Yes, they are. We have one. It's for households with children. It's not very generous, but it's very impactful. And now it's 10:21. Boom.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Krishna. That was so interesting, and a lot of your comments just raise a lot of interesting questions, but we have two questions queued up, and I see one in the chat, and let's try. I see the one in the chat, but try to keep your questions in the Q&A, and we'll start with Adam Levecchia asks, do the data allow you to observe the number of children per household and by age? And this would allow you to estimate the fraction of CCB benefits spent.
Yes and yes. So the Canada Child Benefit is slightly smaller for households for children that are 6 years old or 6 to 18. So it's largest for children under 6, and then for children 6 to 17 is a bit smaller. But we did not detect any differential response between the age group of the children. We did detect a different response for households with more versus less children. And it seemed almost linear. If you have more children than you spend, then the policy effect is larger for these same commodity groups, which are the big ones to look for effects are food, clothing, and shelter.
Thank you. And we have one from Mikhail Skudurud. So Mikhail says, Krishna, do you know how much do you know how much of the rent result is single parents moving out of parents' homes to live with their children, to live alone with their children? Do you see living arrangements in the SHS?
Yes, but the problem is that it's a repeated cross-section. So I don't know what their previous living arrangement was. So I'm just trying to think about how that question could be answered without that retrospective information. I do have information on when did they live at the same address previously, and that's how I'm learning about moving. So I think the answer is maybe.
Great, thanks, Krishna. And we have one from Mark Frenette. Is it possible to identify RESP contributions in the data? And then he says, I should know this, smiley face.
I think yes, you know, like basically they're merged with your tax information. So anything, you know, if the person ticks off the tick box for allowing their tax information to be merged, then we're going to have all of it, every line item from your tax file. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering that myself, what was happening. It's to where maybe the savings was going. Okay, yeah, then Mark adds RESPs are not tax deductible. I was wondering if you looked at the dynamics of it in terms of, did you see in sort of the earliest months different kinds of spending than you see later, whether or not, because I'm just thinking of people with really restricted budgets would have things that they've been waiting to buy.
I mean, you could, but we didn't. You could do it even better now, because when we wrote this paper, so the policy change was in July 2016. And when we wrote the paper, we had data through the end of 2017, which is, you know, 18 months after the policy change. And now the 2018 data are out. So you could do a better job with this. I think the 2019 data might be out by now too.
Yeah, I just think, you know, people would be buying things like contact lenses or glasses or something, and then moving towards a more stable. And we have one question.
That is certainly knowable, but we didn't decide to know it.
Right, yeah. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee who asks, did you notice any regional variability?
Well, so Quebec has a somewhat different childcare environment, childcare and child benefit environment. And so as a matter of just trying to find out whether we were estimating true numbers or not, we have estimates that leave Quebec out, and they're very similar. That's as far as we got on regional anything. Roughly speaking, that little table that I showed you for renters that had like, some people in each box and only about 400 in the box for after the program change has children. If you want to look by region, you're going to have very, very few observations. So we didn't have, and this is kind of the reason that there's a doggy. That's why I keep snapping like that. It's not just the awesomeness of this paper. And so we were not able to do a whole lot of assessment by anything. For example, by age of child, by number of children. It's in appendices, but it's all very hazy and imprecise.
Yeah, some of it was interesting that the rent result the size is quite big for not rent, the expenditure, the housing expenditures were quite big. It's too bad, like the standard errors. Okay, so we have one from Monk Bear. And I think, we have time for this. Did you control household earnings, excluded child money? I might be butchering this a bit. What do you think? What do you think? Whether there was growth in labor income, etc.?
We didn't control for any of that. So if there's, but essentially we are controlling for total expenditure, right? So so the natural way to interpret that is, suppose people faced a disincentive to work after the introduction of this child, or maybe a greater incentive to work because the implicit tax rate did drop. Were their preferences changed by having to go to work, the allocation of money over goods? And we don't really have anything to say about that. It is something that you could speak to in these data. The problem is that the earnings data, all the income data comes from the previous tax year. So it's not really contemporaneous. You don't know what happened to their earnings, that month.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your interesting and thoughtful questions. And thank you, Krishna, for a really interesting talk. And we'll move now to Professor Woolley. You're ready, Frances?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So just a brief introduction. Frances Woolley is a professor of economics at Carleton University and former president of the Canadian Economics Association. Her most cited work is on modeling family decision-making, measuring inequality within the household, feminist economics, and tax benefit policy towards families. Professor Woolley is currently co-editor of the Canadian Tax Journal and academic director of the Carleton Research Data Center. So thank you so much, Frances, and go ahead.
Well, can you hear me okay? Let me check. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for that introduction, Kelly, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my research. Today, I'm going to be attempting to answer the question, what happened to the immigrant satisfaction gap? So let me begin by trying to persuade you this is an interesting question. Okay. When I say satisfaction, what I might mean here is life satisfaction as measured by the Canadian Community Health Survey. Yeah, basically on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is very dissatisfied and 10 is very satisfied, how do you feel about your life as a whole right now? So that's what I mean by satisfaction. By the satisfaction gap, I mean the finding that's been found by many people, including many Canadian research, possibly people who are in the audience today, that migrants typically do not reach similar levels of happiness or life satisfaction to those of natives, by which mean the native, people born in the country. Okay. So that was always the idea, right? Immigrants not as satisfied with life as the Canadian born. We know that. or we thought we did. Well, something happened. Okay, I'm going to show you a bunch of different pictures here. So what we have here is on the left, we have people in midlife, so that's 25 to 54. On the right, we have older people, age 65 and older. On the top, we have men. On the bottom, we have women. In the solid lines, we have the Canadian born. And with the dashed lines, we have immigrants. And I think the picture that's most stark is the picture in the top left, which shows the life satisfaction, no controls, just average life satisfaction of men between the ages of 25 and 54. And what you see is that, go back 2009 up to 2013, 14, definitely seem to have a gap between Canadian born and immigrant, like, in that quote, here are immigrants having lower life satisfaction than the Canadian born. But then it flips in 2015, 16, and then becomes higher. Don't see that pattern at all for the olds. It's only for the people in midlife. Some suggestion of something similar happening for women, but not the clear, kind of reversal that we get for men. So this is like weird. What's going on? Well, there's two possibilities. One is that there's this sort of like the happy story, especially if you're like a policy person and you're involved in immigration policy, that, there's been a lot of changes in immigration policy, and maybe this higher reported life satisfaction is reflecting improved immigrant outcomes and the result of better immigration policy and labor market policy. The other possibility, which is also interesting, is that this change reflects changes in the design of the Canadian Community Health Survey, because there was a major change in 15-16 to the survey, a switch towards responsive design sampling, and also changes to the questions preceding the life satisfaction question. So maybe it's nothing real changed. It's just we started getting different answers to the survey because the survey changed. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the time that I have with you is walk through these two possible explanations and see which one kind of comes out on top. So there are some limitations to testing this idea that maybe immigrant outcomes are improving. And one of them is that the income data isn't collected consistently across waves. And we have many more observations missing income prior to 2015-16. We also have decline in response rates. So when I talk about using controls, I'm going to just try and use controls that I can measure consistently across the waves of the CCHS. And that means I'm not going to be able to do much. I'm going to not control for income because I lose too many observations. But we have occupation, we have education, so I'm not so worried about that. Okay. Now, first test we do. Okay, so remember, it's like, okay, we want to find out if there's something real going on here or if it's just the survey design. Well, one thing we can do is we can control for all consistently measured characteristics of immigrants. So occupation, language, ethnicity, living arrangements, age, education, like everything that we've got. And we assume that the returns in terms of life satisfaction to being married or highly educated or age 20, 25, we assume the returns to those are the same for immigrants and the Canadian born. So if what was happening here is that immigrant satisfaction is rising because immigrants have improved outcomes, then we shouldn't see this kind of we shouldn't see this sort of dramatic narrowing of the gap after we control for immigrants' characteristics, right? If what's happening is immigrants are getting better jobs, once we control for occupation, we should see less of a increase in life satisfaction, for example. Well, that doesn't happen, okay? So this is set up the same way as before. The midlife are on the left, the olds are on the right, men are on the top, women are on the bottom, okay? Now, you see for the olds, actually, once you control for characteristics, and especially for women over 65, satisfaction gap is wiped out. And what's driving that actually, interestingly, is like ethnicity. So I've got the controls here for the 13 ethnicity categories that the that are available in the CCHS. Once you control for those, no difference in life satisfaction of Canadian-born and immigrant women, which is really interesting, and much lower things. But if we focus instead on those in midlife, so that's the left-hand side of this, and especially the men on the top left, we get basically the same pattern as we did before. We have significant immigrant satisfaction gap before up to and including 13, 14, and then it disappears. So, you know, this suggests kind of suggests that there's something going on other than improved outcomes. Now let's cut the data another way. So the Canadian Community Health Survey is a cross-section. So we can't track people over time, but we can track the same group of people over time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at people born between 1960 and 1989. So these were people who were between 20 and 49 in 2009. And we look at people who immigrated before 2009. So this is trying to get at the possibility that maybe it's recent immigrants and better selection of recent immigrants that's causing immigrant life satisfaction to increase, right? If we get rid of the recent immigrants, then we maybe won't see this, okay? Now, I was doing this today and I realized there's a mistake in the labeling of the horizontal axis here. And I'm really sorry if Mike's here. Like I'm really sorry, Mike. I just noted this today. You should see the narrowing happening in 2015-16. The horizontal axis is incorrectly labeled here. So this is the pseudo cohort. On the left, we have with no controls. On the right, we have with controls. And you get the same pattern. You have this dramatic narrowing of the satisfaction gap, especially for men, around 2015-16. Okay, and it's more dramatic for men than for women. And okay, I can't actually see that diagram on the right here, but okay. Now, remember I said there were two possible explanations for the declining immigrant satisfaction gap. The first is that the higher reported life satisfaction reflects improved immigrant outcomes. And there's weak evidence for this in the data. The declining gap is still apparent for men in midlife, even after we control for all the consistently measured social and economic characteristics. So, you know, age, education, living arrangements, language, marital status, province, all these things. Whether we whether we use a pseudo cohort approach or not. An alternative hypothesis is that it may reflect changes in the Canadian Community Health Survey design. And there's two possibilities here. One is the responsive design sampling. And, it could be, but, when you look at the testing of responsive design sampling, you do see changes in the ethnic makeup of the CCHS sample after the adoption of responsive design, but it doesn't, with you weight control, it doesn't seem to be driving it. The alternative is perhaps it's changes in questions preceding the life satisfaction question. So in the old survey, the life satisfaction is preceded by questions about health. And in the new, the life satisfaction is preceded by questions about work. And there's a lot of evidence from other sources that the framing of life satisfaction questions matters. So you get different answers to life satisfaction questions depending upon when you ask them. And it seems quite possible that the inclusion of the work questions before the life satisfaction might have primed men of working age to feel positive about life. So I think it's possible, or it could be that, it's something else, right? CCHS is limited. The controls I have are limited. Maybe there's something else going on. Okay. So in terms of takeaways, my big takeaway from all of this, the analysis here, I'm sure there's going to be issues raised in the question period and reasons why you might, think, this variable was missing, that variable was missing. But the one thing that I feel very confident in saying is that it's very wise to use caution when comparing satisfaction estimates over time, especially when the survey design changes. And that means you need to be extremely careful about using well-being or satisfaction to evaluate policy. Because it's subject to framing effects and they can be quite significant. So you have to be very careful. So how much time do I have, Kelly?
1 more minute.
Okay. One thing I want to leave you with, and this is sort of going to directions for future reference, is there's a question about, in fact, whether or not there ever really was an immigrant satisfaction gap. Now, what I show here on the left-hand panel, again, men on the top, women in the bottom, left-hand panel is white, people who are white, quote unquote. The middle panel is Indigenous Canadians and no immigrant Indigenous Canadians, only Canadian born. And on the left-hand panel is quote unquote visible minorities, so people of color. And what you see here is that when you break down between white, Indigenous, and people of color, there's not big differences between immigrants and the Canadian born. But where there are big differences, especially for women, is between people who are white on the one hand and people who are people of color and Indigenous on the other hand. And this, I find this chart really alarming because we have an idea that people of color catch up, or that immigrants catch up, right? First generation has it rough, but people catch up, and then, people of color really well integrated, and so on and so forth. This is not good. I mean, this shows to me a very disturbing a gap. So this is where I think there's a need for for us to ask hard questions and really look at this data more. Okay, so thank you.
Thanks, Frances. Yeah, it's so interesting. We have 2 questions and queued up already, and everybody is very welcome to write your questions in the Q&A section, and I'll start with the 2 that we have. If the priming effect was an explaining factor, we should expect to see a secular shift in the satisfaction levels for both immigrants / non-immigrants, but this doesn't seem to show up in your graphics. Can you comment?
Yeah, because I would say not, it's how the framing is, right? So the question that used to come before was about health, right? And we know that immigrants tend to experience declining health when they're in Canada. And so if you're an immigrant, you think about, what are the sources of life satisfaction? Well, family, health, cultural stuff, and then work. Probably if you're an immigrant, the work is the thing that's good for you, right? Because you've moved for better things. What's not good for you is declining health, missing family, culture. So if you prime people to think about work, I suspect that's why you get it, because you don't get the effect for older people and you get a stronger effect for men. But yeah, like, you don't have to believe this. To some extent, it's, I can't prove anything. I don't have proof here.
And of course, I'm muted. That questioner says, this is good context. Thank you. In response, yes, so thank you. And the next question is, can we really measure, this is quite a broad question, can we really measure satisfaction from recorded data on some variables? For satisfaction is a feeling which is very personal. Different people have different reasons to immigrate. So that's quite a broad question, and I think you can take it.
I would say that the literature, and I should have looked through the audience to see who I was going to offend. I would say that people very often play fast and loose with these questions, and people will very often use life satisfaction questions and then talk about happiness. So you'll see, for example, people will publish like happiness reports and say some question is a happy place, and they're talking about life satisfaction, and life satisfaction and happiness are different. So I would say that one has to be, these questions measure the answer to these questions, and life satisfaction is different from other things. And it could be, and in some sense, like satisfaction, being satisfied with where you are is kind of like giving up, right? Like, how satisfied are you? Well, I've done everything. I'm okay. I know I'm going to retire. I'm all right. So I totally agree that this kind of data is very easily misinterpreted, especially in the media. And you absolutely have to start with looking at the question, and all you got is how people answer that question.
So the next question is quite related, actually. So we have from Lynn Forget, was life satisfaction precisely defined for the respondents in each survey? And if so, what were the differences?
Okay, that's the first question. Sorry, the first slide. I'll just share my screen again and throw up the slides. And that is slide number 2. This is the measure. Okay, this is the answer. This is what we've got.
How do you feel about your life as a whole?
Yeah. So it's that satisfaction with life and in general.
Okay, and the question itself didn't change, just
no, and that's why we can't go back, because it did change in 2009, and before 2009 there was a similar question that but it was a 1 to 5 scale. And if you look, but you can go back to 2002 with that earlier question, and if you do, you get that similar immigrant satisfaction gap. So that I just stuck with the years for which I had the exact same life satisfaction question.
Okay, thank you. So good. We're more and more, each question breeds a new question. So we have Michael Wolfson. Given your finding, RE, the significance of ethnicity in one instance, is this a more general finding? E.g., are some ethnicities just more satisfied with their lives?
Filipinos, you want to be Filipino.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting in terms of the directions that we get to the very last slide. Oh, I think I actually didn't. I didn't do it, but I've been going into the RDC and looking at the impact of immigrant category, and people in the provincial nominee program seem to be happier. But when you control for ethnicity, the effect goes away, because basically, like, Filipinos are really happy and they're provincial nominees. And so this is, again, I didn't want to get into this, but these are some of the things, like, if you want to, like, increase life satisfaction, just have loads of Filipinos immigrate.
Okay.
This is being recorded, is it? Oh yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Thanks, Frances. So Mikkel says, interesting stuff, Frances. I agree. I might have missed it, but are there other Canadian data sources with satisfaction/happiness questions? And when do we get new data from this source? Have they maintained the questionnaire? And I'm going to throw in there, is there any chance they're going to randomize order?
Okay, the General Social Survey has it. So in terms of the evidence that framing matters, that a lot of that comes from the General Social Survey, because it's obviously, the General Social Survey asks about framing in different contexts, depending on which wave, and you tend to end up with kind of different results.
Okay, thank you. And next up, how would you counter local level studies where they show lower level of satisfaction because of education/skill and job mismatch?
I mean, certainly, Feng Hu has done some great work where he documents that, and absolutely, that sort of thing is important. But I mean, what I would say is, that if you think about that pseudo cohort diagram, the one with the, I'll just put it up again. If we think about the pseudo cohort diagram, the one with the, I did this diagram so many times, and I checked it so many times, and it still ended up being wrong. The one with the axis labeled wrong. Okay, so this is a pseudo cohort, right? This is all people who were in Canada before 2009, and we're tracking them over time. And then look at that jump between what is actually 13, 14, and 15, 16. Like, I don't see that as being, it just doesn't seem to me plausible that you have that much of a change in matching over 2 years, over like between 13, 14 and 15, 16. It's too jump. If it's too sharp a jump, if it was I mean, yes, this stuff matters. I believe that previous research that, being in a job where you're underemployed, it sucks. But the jump is too sharp to explain it in that way.
Okay, thank you, Frances. We are approaching the time that we need to wrap up, and I'll just ask one quick question from the chat. It's a multiple parter, but I'm gonna just leave one here for our last question. Can you know when those immigrants came in Canada, especially what age?
I can in my I'd actually answer a different question from the chat, but I'm going to answer that question, and then I'm going to answer another one.
Sure.
I do have the CCHS matched with the immigration database, And so I want to get back into the RDC and look at some of these questions. And that's absolutely something that I would like to look at in future research. I don't remember whether or not I had age at immigration as a control variable in this. Like it's been a little bit of a while. The other thing, the question though that I wanted to ask is could it be child benefits that is doing this? And I looked at that and I think I found out that it didn't. But that is again something that would be a potential direction for future research, because I haven't looked at that super closely. It's too bad that the redesign happened so closely to the child benefit thing.
Thanks, Frances. I missed those. I'm glad you caught those good questions, Frances. I missed those.
Yeah.
So thank you so much to Krishna Pendakur and Frances Woolley for both of these very interesting talks, and for everybody gathering today with their great questions. I will turn it back over to Perry for concluding comments from the CRDCN.
You got it right. Thank you so much, Frances and Krishna, for these very informative presentations. It was really, really interesting to hear you both speak. And thank you everyone for coming and attending this webinar. And we hope to see you next time. Bye.